Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and merciful. Assalamu alaikum. May peace, blessings, and mercy of Allah be upon you and to all the messengers of Allah, and in particular on the noble and final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his family, and his companions. Let me present to you the fourth lecture video series of CIA Part 2 Practice of Internal Auditing for all the exams beginning in 2020. In this video, we will be completing our section B and we will be starting the section C as well. Let's have a brief recap of what we learned in the fourth lecture video series. We talked about the requirements of engagement planning, needs of engagement objectives, requirements of engagement scope, requirements of engagement work program, characteristics of audit evidence, types of engagement procedures, and difference between tracing and vouching. What does the standard 2030 resource management say? The chief audit executive must ensure that internal audit resources are appropriate, sufficient, and effectively deployed to achieve the approved plan. Appropriate refers to the mix of knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform the plan. Sufficient refers to the quantity of resources needed to accomplish the plan. Resources are effectively deployed when they are used in a way that optimizes the achievement of the approved plan. What does the standard 2230 engagement resource allocation say? Internal auditors must determine appropriate and sufficient resources to achieve engagement objectives based on an evaluation of the nature and complexity of each engagement, time constraints, and available resources. What are the factors that need to be considered while allocating engagement resources? Internal auditors consider the following when determining the appropriateness and sufficiency of resources: the number and experience level of the internal audit staff, knowledge, skills, and other competencies of the internal audit staff when selecting internal auditors for the engagement, availability of external resources where additional expertise and competencies are required, training needs of internal auditors. Here comes the end of section B lecture video series. The candidates are required to kindly complete all the 16 true and false questions from the study book. Section C is known as conducting internal audit engagements and has a weightage of 40%. What is a preliminary survey? The preliminary survey, also called an on-site survey, allows the internal auditor to start collecting and become familiar with the initial information about the activity to be reviewed without getting into details. What are the objectives of the preliminary survey? The preliminary survey should accomplish several objectives, allowing the internal auditor to: number one, become familiar with the client's objectives and goals, organizational structure and key staff, operations, facilities, key customers and suppliers, risk management, control and governance systems, information systems. Number two, concentrate the audit work on significant matters. Number three, identify low risk areas and then reduce the audit time spent on them. Number four, create a cooperative tone for the engagement. What purpose does the review of prior audit reports serve? The review of prior audit reports is valuable because of it. Number one, allows the auditor to become familiar with the audit subject. Number two, shows how other auditors approach the assignment. Number three, helps the auditor decide the scope of the current audit. Number four, identifies problem areas. Number 5, identify areas that may need additional evaluation. Number 6, reveal whether or not the action was taken on past recommendations. What are the types of interviewing for information gathering process? There are four types of interviews for the various stages of the information gathering process. Number 1, preliminary. This interview establishes a relationship with the interviewees, helps them feel comfortable with the auditor, and sets the groundwork for the importance of the process. Number 2, fact gathering. During this interview, facts are collected about a specific situation. Number 3, follow up. The auditor gathers additional information to clarify issues that were raised in previous discussions. Number 4, exit. The auditor conducts final checks to verify the accuracy of the information. How can the auditor decrease anxiety with the interview process? The auditor can decrease the anxiety commonly associated with the interview process by explaining how the engagement may be helpful to the individual, emphasizing that everyone is on the same team and working towards the same goals, demonstrating an understanding of the individual and the situation, listening sympathetically and resisting the impulse to criticize immediately or nitpick. When should surprise interviews be done? Surprise interviews should be conducted only in the case of fraud interviews or any other circumstance in which the interviewee must not have time to prepare. Can interviews be recorded? Under, circum- Under certain circumstances, interviews may sometimes be recorded. However, audio or video recordings should be made only if it is necessary and only with the agreement and permission of the interviewee. The auditor should keep in mind that the presence of a recording device has the potential to make people uncomfortable, hesitant, and more close with their answers. Define audit sampling. Audit sampling is defined as the application of audit procedures to less than 100% of items within a class of transactions or account balance, such that all sampling units have an equal chance of selection. Define sampling risk. Sampling risk is defined as the risk that the internal auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from the conclusion if the entire population was subjected to the same audit procedure. What is the requirement of the standard 2320 analysis and evaluation? Internal auditors must base conclusions and engagement results on appropriate analysis and evaluations. Define sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful information. Sufficient in that the information is factual, adequate, and convincing so that a prudent, informed person would reach the same conclusions as the auditor. Reliable in that the information is the best available information through the use of appropriate engagement techniques. Relevant in that the information supports engagement observations and recommendations and is consistent with the objectives for the engagement. Useful in that the information helps assure that the organization will meet its goals. What is statistical sampling? Statistical sampling involves the use of techniques from which mathematically constructed conclusions regarding the population can be drawn. Statistical sampling allows the auditor to draw conclusions supported by arithmetic confidence levels regarding a population of data output. the internal auditor should validate the completeness of the population to ensure that the sample is selected from an appropriate data set. What is non statistical sampling? Non statistical sampling is an approach used by the auditor who wants to use his or her own experience and knowledge to determine the sample size. Non statistical sampling may not be based objectively, and sample may be subject to bias and not representative of the population. What are the prerequisites of statistical sampling? Statistical, statistical sampling requires the following. Number one, training the auditors in the necessary methods. Number two, designing the samples to meet statistical requirements. And number three, selecting the items to be tested. What is attribute sampling? Attribute sampling is used in the test of controls. Attribute sampling tests for the existence of a specific characteristic. In many situations, attribute sampling is used to test compliance with a particular procedure or control. What is variable sampling? Variable sampling is used in the substantive testing. Variable sampling is used when the auditor is testing for the amount of a certain item. What is sampling risk? Sampling risk is defined as the risk that the internal auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from the conclusion if the entire population was subjected to the same audit procedure. What are the two types of sampling risk? There are two types of sampling risk. Incorrect acceptance. Incorrect acceptance is the risk that the attribute or assertion tested is assessed as unlikely when in fact it is likely. Incorrect rejection. Incorrect rejection is the risk that the attribute or assertion tested is assessed as likely when in fact it is not likely. Define tolerable error. Tolerable errors are the maximum number of errors that the auditor is willing to accept and still reach the conclusion that the underlying assertion is correct. What are the expected errors? Expected errors are errors that the auditor expects in the population based on prior audit results, changes in processes, and evidence or conclusions from other sources. Explain the risk of incorrect acceptance. In attribute sampling, the risk of incorrect acceptance is the risk that the auditor will test the sample and determine the control is working when in fact the control is not working. In variable sampling, the risk of incorrect acceptance is the risk that the auditor will test a sample and determine that the balance is correct when in fact it is not. Explain the risk of incorrect rejection. In attribute sampling, the risk of incorrect rejection is the risk that the auditor will test the sample and determine that the control is not working when in reality the control is working. In variable sampling, the risk of incorrect rejection is the risk that the auditor will test a sample and determine that the balance is not correct when the balance is correct. On what factors the sample size depends? Some considerations for the sample size are audit objectives. The auditor needs to ensure that the population and the sample of the population will help achieve the objective. Nature of the population. The auditor must be aware of both the size and variability of the population. The larger the population, the larger the sample needs to be. Sampling and selection methods. It is important that these methods that are used help achieve the objectives. Level of sampling risk the auditor is willing to accept. The amount of risk that the auditor is willing to accept and the size of the sample are inversely proportional. That is, the lower the acceptable risk of error, the larger the sample size will need to be. Tolerable deviation rate in the population. This figure reflects the number of deviations that can be found within the sample and still conclude that it is correct. The lower the acceptable number, the larger the sample needs to be. Expected error in the population. The larger the expected error in the population, the larger the sample size needs to be. What are the methods for selecting the sample? Judgmental or haphazard sampling. With this method, the auditor uses professional judgment to determine the size of the sample and then select the items to be tested without any bias or particular reason for excluding or including an item. This method can be used only in non-statistical sampling. Number 2, random number sampling. With this method, the auditor uses a random number generator to select the items to be tested. This method is done without bias and each item has an equal chance of being selected. Number 3, stratified sampling. With this method, the auditor breaks the population into different levels based on the size of the items within the population. Within each of these strata, the auditor determines a separate testing method. The primary goal of stratified sampling is to reduce the effect of variances within the population by making more populations of similar items. As a result, this method is most useful when the items within the population are diversified. Systematic sampling. With this method, the auditor selects a starting point within the population and then determines an interval. Block sampling. With this method, the auditor chooses a block or group of items within the population. Block sampling makes it easier to locate individual items to include in the sample. Furthermore, it is best used to test the application of a new control or control over time. What is stratification? Stratification is the process of segregating a population into homogeneous subpopulations explicitly defined so that each sampling unit can belong to only one subpopulation depending on the criteria used for stratification. What are the main methods of attribute sampling? Auditor uses attribute sampling to test the internal controls. The main methods of attribute sampling are: number 1, acceptance sampling. This is a quality control tool that classifies an item as either acceptable or unacceptable. Number 2, sequential sampling. This is used when the sample follows a number of steps or includes a number of requirements, any of which would lead to a deviation if one of the steps or requirements is not correct. Number 3, discovery sampling. Discovery sampling tests for fraud and thus it is an investigative technique. The auditor looks for any single deviation on the assumption that there are no mistakes in the population. Stop or go sampling. This method is used to reduce the sample size by testing only enough items to prove that the rate of deviation is less than the acceptable rate of error. This sampling technique minimizes the sample size whenever a low rate of non-compliance is expected. What should the auditor do if an error is discovered in a sample? Whenever the auditor selects and tests a sample, there is a chance that the sample will contain errors. If an error is confirmed, the auditor should perform additional testing to determine, is the error isolated or connected to other errors? Are many small immaterial errors combining to create a material error? Is there a control weakness that could allow other errors? Is the population as a whole correct or not? What are the methods of variable sampling? There are three methods of variable sampling. Number one, mean per unit sampling. The auditor tests a sample of items that obtain the audited value of these tested items verified by the audit and calculates an average amount per item. This average amount per item is then multiplied by the number of items in the population. The auditor does not need to know the book value or the recorded value of the sample items. Number two, difference estimation. The auditor finds the average difference between the book value or recorded value and the audited amount of the items in the sample verified by the audit and then multiplies the average error by the number of items in the population. Finally, the auditor determines if the account is reasonably stated. Number three, ratio method. The auditor determines a ratio between the book amounts or recorded value of the sample and the audited amounts of the sample verified by the audit and then apply this ratio to the population as a whole. This method is most effective when the book and audited values are similar. What is probability proportional to size sampling? Probability proportional to size sampling, also called dollar unit sampling or monetary unit sampling, is a form of variable sampling where the auditor uses the dollars within the population instead of the number of invoices or some other identifier of each account or invoice. This type of sampling is often used with very diverse values or amounts because this method automatically stratifies the population. PPS has two unique characteristics that are important to consider in determining whether or not it should be used. PPS automatically stratifies the population because the largest items will have the most likelihood of being selected and the smallest items the least chance. Number two, PPS is more effective in the detection of overstatements rather than understatements because the smaller the item is, the less likely it is to be tested. Furthermore, a zero balance item or an item that has not been recorded has no chance of being selected for testing. All the topics presented in this video has been taken from my CIA Part 2 Practice of Internal Auditing study book for 2020. The link to subscribe the same is mentioned in the description of the video. Please share your feedback, recommendations and comments. WhatsApp me on 923112224261 for any study related queries. Have a nice day. Take care. Allah Hafiz.